Hi, Kimberly. Can you hear me? Hello?
Pam, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
This
Thank
is
you.
Veronica.
Thank you, Veronica.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Rudy Espinoza, Chair of the Advisory Districting Committee, and I call this meeting to order. So good evening, and thank you for tuning into our virtual Advisory Districting Committee meeting. Attending the meeting tonight via teleconference are the committee members, Brown, Buckmaster, Covey, Gardner, Gasparini, Hicks-Dumansky, Pena, and Sell. Vice Chair Lacefield, myself, Committee Chair Espinoza Murray, and newly appointed member Chaudhry, who will be sworn in shortly. We also have city staff and staff from the city's redistricting consultant, redistricting partners. They're also participating via teleconference. We're offering Spanish translation for all advisory redistricting committee meetings through a dial-in conference line. If you wish to hear the meeting in Spanish, please dial 669-900-6833, enter meeting ID 346-830-8566, and password 1017. Again, that number is 669-900-6833, meeting ID 346-830-8566, and the password is 1017, and the instructions will be shown on the screen. Estamos ofreciendo traducciones en español para esta reunión de comité a través de una línea de conferencia. Si quieren participar en la reunión en español, por favor marque el 669-900-6833 y pueden ingresar el número de identificación de la reunión 346-830-8566 y la clave 1017. Otra vez, el número telefónico es 669-900-6833. El número de identificación de la reunión es 346-830-8566 y la clave 1017. Y vamos a estar con el traductor Gonzalo Córdoba, que va a estar dando las instrucciones en español. Now, we're going to be moving on to our next item, which is roll call. So now I'm going to ask our city clerk, Pamela Aguilar, to call the roll.
Thank you, Chair Espinoza Murray. When I call your name, please state here or present. District 1 member Buckmaster.
Present.
District 2 member Pena.
Present.
District 3 member Coffey.
Present.
And District 5 committee member Lacefield.
Present.
District 6 committee member Gardner.
Present.
District 7 committee member Gasparini.
Here.
At-large member Brown.
Here.
At-large member Hicks-Dumansky.
Here.
At-large member Selk.
Here.
And Chair Espinoza Murray.
Present.
And also joining us, who, as mentioned, I will swear in shortly, is newly appointed at-large member Rumika Chaudhry. I turn it back to the chair.
Thank you, Pamela. I appreciate that. The next item on the agenda is a swearing in of the new ARC member. So we'll now move to that item of business.
At this time, I'd like to ask new member Rumika Chaudhry if she could turn on her video and unmute her mic.
Yes, I'm here. This is Rumika.
Great. At this time, I'm going to administer to you your oath of office. If you could please raise your right hand, and then you will repeat the oath after me.
Okay.
I, please state your name,
I, Rumika Chaudhry,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully
and that I will well and faithfully
discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations to Ramika Chaudhry. Welcome to the team.
Thank you.
At this time, we'll proceed to public comment. Instructions for public comment are on the screen. Use the hand raise feature to request to speak. And if you're calling in, press *9 to request to speak. Each speaker will have 3 minutes, and I will now turn it over to the city clerk to facilitate public comment.
Thank you, Chair Espinosa Marie. As mentioned, now's the time for public comment. You can comment on any item that is not on the agenda. And if we ask that you please raise your hand and keep it raised so that we can see how many speakers that we have. And we'll give it a minute. Okay.
All right.
Yes, I think that's, we don't have any raised hands, so we can close public comment at this time.
Thank you, Pamela. Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
All right, moving to item number 5, and that's approving the July 7th meeting minutes. Does anyone have any comments, corrections, or a motion to approve the minutes?
This is Lisa. I have a comment.
The chair recognizes Lisa.
I just have a question. So when we see all the names on our Zoom call here, I noted down everyone's name last time, but not all those names appeared as attendees for the meeting minutes. And I'm just curious, do we identify people who are on these Zoom calls who might not have identified themselves as members of the public? Do we ask for members of the public to identify themselves, whether or not they're making public comment? I'm just curious about the people who show up on the Zoom call but are not called out as attendees of the meeting.
City Clerk Aguilar, would you be able to answer that question?
I can. The minutes will reflect the members of the committee who are present and also those who make public comment. There isn't a requirement that we list every attendee who is present on the Zoom call.
Thank you. But if we see names of people that we don't recognize, can we ask these persons to identify themselves, or is that just, they just do or they don't during public comment?
They're anybody this is a public meeting, so anybody is welcome to join. They are not required to identify themselves.
Thank you for that clarification.
To the committee. You're welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. And is there another hand raised? Veronica?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is Veronica Ramirez, City Attorney, and Ms. Aguilar actually answered the question. I wanted to make sure that we don't require the identification of members of the public. We want them to feel safe to come in and participate in any way that they wish.
Thank you, Veronica. I appreciate your response. If there are no further comments, corrections, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve.
I second
Is
the
there a
motion.
second?
Yeah, second.
Thank you. Moved and properly second. I guess we can go ahead and vote since we already asked for comments or discussion. All those in favor, please signify by raising your hand using the raise hand function on Zoom.
Oh, actually, Chair, because it is a remote, or we have remote participants, we must take a roll call.
Roll call. That's right. I'm so sorry. You're so right.
No problem.
So I'll hand it over to you, Pamela, if you can help us with a roll call vote.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
This is a motion to approve the minutes. We'll start with Committee Member Buckmaster.
Yes.
Committee Member Pena,
Aye.
Committee Member Covey,
Aye.
Committee Member Gardner,
Yes.
Committee Member Gasparini,
Yes.
Committee Member Brown,
Yes.
Committee Member Chaudhry,
Yes.
Committee Member Hicks Dumansky,
Yes.
Committee Member Selk,
Yes.
Vice Chair Lacefield,
Aye.
and Chair Espinosa Murray.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, Pamela. I appreciate you taking the roll call vote. The next item of business is item number 6, Community of Interest, Testimony, Best Practices, and Federal Voting Rights Act training that will be conducted by Kimi Shigatani from Redistricting Partners on tonight's training presentation.
I'll go ahead and jump in. This is Connie Malloy with Redistricting Partners. Good evening. Great to see you all again. And the last time that we were with you, there were a number of questions that organically started to come up regarding legal parameters around redistricting, and also, of course, around communities of interest, best practices, and how to solicit it and how to incorporate it into the maps that you'll be drawing. And so you're really going to be in good hands tonight with the training that we've lined up for you. Angelo Anchetta is joining us this evening, and I'll just share a little bit about his background. He is really has been in your shoes first as someone who served as a redistricting commissioner at the state level in California. But he also has many years under his belt as both a practicing attorney and also as a legal scholar. Some of the places here in California that he's been teaching have been Santa Clara University, UCLA in Los Angeles, on the East Coast at Harvard, and at New York University School of Law. Some of the areas of his specialty include election law, voting rights, the use of scientific evidence in constitutional litigation. He's written multiple books and is someone who has also been in the nonprofit arena, serving as an administrator within legal services provided to communities on issues around immigration and other civil rights. So we know that you're going to get quite a bit of both his just understanding at the federal level, what are some of the key pieces of legal parameters, in particular, the Voting Rights Act. And then as you get into communities of interest, he'll be able to really talk through more the nuts and bolts of the different trade-offs and the process and the ways that you can engage and really elicit the best testimony for a set of maps that truly reflects all corners of your community. And so with that, I believe Professor Anchetta is on the line, and I'll ask us to pull up those slides and let him take it away. And we'll stop at there'll be 2 parts to the presentation. The first will be focusing on the legal parameters, and then we can have questions built into that. And then we'll get into communities of interest and do the same.
Hi, well, thank you, Connie. Let me get my screen up. So I'm screen sharing, is this right? Let's do that then. Oh, no, I'm not screen sharing, okay. So will someone put the slides up then, since I cannot share screens?
Hi, Angelo. We will get you access to share your screen in just a moment.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm in San Francisco, and I was just doing Oakland. So this is the magic of Zoom and the virtual world. I'm going from Oakland to Redwood City in an instant. So, happy to be with you. And I do apologize. I have a 5-year-old who's been pretty good so far the last hour. So she's rather unpredictable sometimes. If you get some background noise, forgive me.
Hi, Angela. You actually should be able to share your screen, but we're going to share it on our end just to assist.
Okay, let me try it now. Yeah, I'm still getting a host disabled screen sharing. And if I should log back in or?
Angela, Jessica is going to help with the screen sharing, so you don't have to worry about it.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
fine.
you're, we will facilitate the PowerPoint for you, Angela. And just feel free to say next slide.
Okay, let me do one thing because I've noticed when I do this, when I'm not the one screen sharing, I can't always see the slides. So let me get parallel set up here. Just a moment. In case I get. Okay, very good. Okay, next slide, please. That's just me there in the cover. So we're going to cover two topics, just sort of the basics of the criteria and more specifically communities of interest. So you're going to be dealing with a number of different sources of law here, quite a bit on the federal level. And there are a number of criteria that are listed under what's called the Fair Maps Act, which is a state law that applies to county and city government. You are a charter city, but because your charter, at least at this point, doesn't really have an enumerated set of criteria, you're bound by the state law. Other cities, like Oakland, for example, because of a charter amendment a few years ago, they did incorporate more specifics into their charter. So this is something you have the option of doing that in the future if your voters are up for that. And then we'll cover a number of areas of related to the communities of interest criterion, and then leave some room for questions. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just as an overview here, we're going to be talking about federal constitutional law. We'll spend a fair amount of time on the federal VRA. You have a particular history here because you just went to districts fairly recently, so you were subject to some potential VRA litigation under the California VRA, and simply decided to settle and move to districting fairly quickly. The California VRA doesn't really apply to you anymore because it doesn't apply to redistricting, but that is part of the history, and it is certainly relevant as you're looking at federal VRA compliance. Okay, as I mentioned, you're not bound by anything in the charter in terms of specific redistricting criteria, so you're going to be going to the state law. I've listed a couple on this slide, just listed a couple of sections of the Fair Maps Act dealing with things like timelines and public hearing requirements. I'm not going to cover that this evening, but certainly want to be aware of those sections as you're moving forward with gathering information from the public. Okay, next slide. Okay, so federal law. So the major areas that you're going to be have to be conscious of have to do with what's called the one person, one vote requirement. And this is essentially a requirement that your districts have the same population. They don't have to be perfectly equal. There's actually room for some deviation between the districts, but you want to keep them close in population. And as you're moving forward with your consultant, that'll be something that you'll constantly be checking in terms of a deviation. But that's something to be mindful of. And it is always the top ranking criterion in terms of one person, one vote. You also have to be careful of how you consider race in redistricting. Again, as you know, you've gone through a districting process a couple of years ago, and certainly you did look at creating majority minority districts in Redwood City. So it's not that you can't consider race. In fact, you have to when you're looking at VRA compliance, but you have to be careful about letting race predominate as a factor. So we'll talk a little bit about that. You don't want to be splitting districts or splitting populations between districts. You don't want to over-concentrate them. That's something that is prohibited under the 15th Amendment. And again, the VRA, and we'll talk about some case law, particularly the case of Thornburg versus Jingles as applied to your districting. Okay, next slide. Okay, so population equality. You don't have to have them absolutely equal. Only congressional districts have to be to that level of equality. So there is what's known as a substantially equal requirement, and approximately something less than 10% deviation, and we'll cover that in a moment in terms of how that's calculated. But you have to try to work to keep the districts roughly of the same size in terms of population. You do look at the total population when you're calculating that. You don't do a subset like just citizens or just voting age citizens. It has to be the total population. And those are the numbers you'll be getting from the census, or from the statewide database, which will process the census data. And you should be getting that data sometime in late August, early September is the expectation. One thing to be aware of is that there is a requirement under state law to reallocate prison population, so that folks who are counted in the state correctional facilities are reallocated to their home residences. You don't have to worry about that, but just be aware that when you get the data from the statewide database, that reallocation will have occurred, so that the data will be adjusted to move prison populations into their home residences. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned before, you look at the deviation, and again, you don't have to keep a running tally of this. Your consultant will do that. That is part of the software, so they will tell you if the districts are starting to get a little too big or too small. But in essence, and this is just where the math comes from. You look at the smallest district and the largest district, and you look at that difference, and you compare that with a perfect equal district size, and you look at the deviation, look at the spread between the smallest and the largest, and the magic number is basically 10%. So if you stay below 10%, you're generally in pretty good shape. No legal problems there. You can go above 10% if you feel there's a compelling reason to do it. For example, VRA compliance might suggest going a little bit higher than 10%, but you need to have a really good reason for doing it. You can, if you want to, set targets below 10%. That's not legally required. The state commission did that a few years ago, but if you decide you just want to draw the districts first and then look at the deviations later, that's perfectly okay. A lot of folks do it that way, but if you want to, you can set a goal or some sort of target below 10%. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the 14th Amendment also prohibits what's called racial gerrymandering. And this is closely connected with the Voting Rights Act, but it's sort of a check on looking at race too strongly. So even though you do have to look at race as you're deciding whether you need to create a district that complies with the VRA, you can't create districts that are only looking at race, or race really predominates, or where the districts are very, very oddly shaped. They're not really compact, and it's designed to promote some sort of racial interest or promote racial demographics. Again, the VRA may require you to draw certain kinds of districts, and that's a defense to any sort of constitutional claim. The other thing, which is just a good way to think about this, is as you're looking at your districts and you're looking at populations, you can consider race, but look at other factors in tandem with race. So look at economic factors, look at other neighborhood characteristics that could keep a particular population together. So it's not all about race or just about race. There's a lot of other factors that you're weighing as you're putting the districts together. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just to introduce the concept here of packing and cracking, the 15th Amendment is a prohibition on intentional discrimination. The VRA actually covers both intentional and non-intentional. So even if you didn't intend to discriminate on the basis of race, you might be doing it in how you create your districts. But the 15th Amendment has a very clear prohibition on diluting minority voting strength. And the two common terms that are used are what are called packing, which is over-concentrating voters in a district, or cracking, which is dividing them in a particular population into multiple districts, so two or more districts. So we'll go to the next slide and look at a visual example here. So if you think of the orange population there as a minority population, in the first example, you see minority voters are two populations that are not quite connected, but they're pretty sizable, and they're both in one district, and where you might have a pattern where you could create two separate districts that have those populations, you put them all in one, that's packing. In the second example, you see them divided up among four districts, and that's an example of cracking. So you're dividing populations to weaken their voting strength. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the federal VRA, the major section of the VRA you're going to be dealing with is what is known as Section 2. There used to be a section, or there's another section called Section 5, which was applicable to some parts of California last time in 2011, but that's been sort of nullified by Supreme Court cases of the last few years. So you're concerned primarily with Section 2. And this is sort of a general anti-discrimination provision that protects both racial minorities and what are known as language minorities. And language minorities is a way of sort of extending the VRA to include Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans, in addition to Black populations. Okay. You may, as you're hearing testimony or getting input from the public, you may hear about other ethnic populations that might not be covered by the VRA, but could be kept together as a community of interest. So if you deal with, say, various European groups, or Arab Americans, as an example, is not covered explicitly by the VRA, but could constitute a community of interest, you can use that criterion to maintain a population. But the VRA itself only protects a particular set of covered minorities. Okay. Again, packing and cracking is clearly a violation. The thing to remember is that when you're dealing with a federal VRA, there's no mandate unless you're getting sued, and you're doing this prior to any kind of litigation. Hopefully nothing comes up for you, but you're in essence trying to anticipate potential litigation against you. So you're trying to create districts that if you were to be sued, you would say, well, we are creating a Section 2 compliant district. So it doesn't impose specific requirements like you create any particular set of majority minority districts, but you have to sort of treat it as a risk assessment. Okay, are we drawing districts that we think if we were to get sued, we would be able to defend and say, well, here's the district that we think is appropriate, and we can defend here. One thing to note, there was a recent Supreme Court decision affecting the VRA and enforcement of different kinds of laws outside of redistricting. That case does not really impact redistricting case law at all. So don't worry about that in terms of what you're going to be doing, but it does create a lot of restrictions on VRA litigation, but not in this context. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when you're looking at VRA compliance, there's a major case that was released by the Supreme Court back in 1986, and it's been the major case that the lower courts have followed. And as again, you've been through CVRA, a CVRA related process. So the CVRA, just FYI, is different from the federal VRA because there's certain requirements that are not in the CVRA, but they're very closely tracking each other. So I suspect that, I haven't looked at what the current districts look like, but I suspect that they were drawn to comply with jingles as well as with the state law. So there's three major requirements. One is you have to have a large and compact minority population that could be in a single district. And if it were in a district, it would be the majority of the citizen voting age population. Okay, this is different from how you look at population equality more generally, where you're looking at everybody, the total population. When you're looking at VRA compliance, you're looking at a subset, because what's called the CVAP, the citizen voting age population, that's the population that could vote. Okay, obviously when you're dealing with the district, there's folks who are minors, who are not citizens, there's a lot of folks who are not going to be part of the political process in terms of voting. But when you're looking at VRA compliance, you are concerned about who could vote and who could vote together. So the first thing to look at, and this is something I would suggest to you, you look at up front, is do you have particular areas where you have large minority populations, and could they be a majority? Now again, you just went through districting a couple of years ago, so a lot of this work may have already been done, and you just have to kind of update it with some more recent data that is available to you. But it's something you have to look at first. The other thing, which might not be in the record of your CVRA process, is whether there's racially polarized voting. So parts 2 and 3 of the Jingles test look at how the minority group votes. Do they vote together? And the third part is there block voting that generally defeats minority candidates because folks in that block don't vote differently, and they vote to defeat the minority groups candidates. Now, my understanding is you didn't get to a stage in litigation because you settled fairly quickly and went to districting, that this inquiry is not necessarily something that was in evidence. So you have to decide whether you want to dig a little deeper here, or you feel comfortable with assuming that there is polarized voting, because unlike a jurisdiction that may have gone through a lawsuit and had some evidence introduced, you only have alleged polarized voting because you went to districts right away. So this is something you have to think about as you're looking at the current districts, and if you're looking to modify them, because you probably have districts now that would satisfy the first element of the Jingles test, but you might not have the evidence yet for the second and third ones. Now you may get some of that from other sources. Maybe the state, which is going to be doing some polarized voting analysis, they might have some information related to Redwood City or to San Mateo County or the region that would support polarized voting specifically in Redwood City. There may be other data that was produced in the process. So that's something to think about as you're trying to look at the districts and how you're complying with the VRA. Again, at this point, you do need to get some updated data to make sure you have the right population figures. There are some additional elements of the Jingles test, looking at the history of Redwood City and the electoral history. And that's something that's part of a lawsuit if it were to go forward. But you want to take a look at some of that too. And again, that may have been brought up in some of the early work around the CVRA litigation. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry, it's a little small here, but a few points here. One thing that I suspect, because your districts were they're pretty new. So I don't think you have they were using the most recent census data that's available in the American Community Survey. So that's the data that will have the citizen voting age population data through 2019. So you want to take a look at that data. It's going to be in what are called block group level data, and just see that the current districts might align with what's in that data. But you certainly want to do that up front, because that'll give you a sense of where the districts are, where the concentrations are. Okay, again, you have a history. You've drawn districts that were designed to specifically affect minority populations. So you're sort of ahead of the game in terms of compared to other jurisdictions. Okay. And again, you don't have a record, a real court record, or there hasn't been evidence introduced about polarized voting, but you may have some other data set that you can rely on. This is probably a factor that went into play when districts were drawn, but you very often have to raise the percentage of minorities within a district to something above 50%, particularly when you're dealing with Latino and Asian populations, because there are higher levels of immigrants in the district typically, and turnout levels are lower. So that's a factor that often weighs into creating an effective minority district, particularly dealing with immigrant populations. So that's something to just consider as you're moving forward. It is possible to create a coalition district. Now, again, you've gone through the city went through a process of drawing districts a couple of years ago. I don't know if they considered coalition districts, but they're not always, I shouldn't say they're not required, but they're the area of law that deals with coalition districts is not particularly well settled. So if you want to draw a coalition district, I would say it's safe to take a look at those and consider them, but understand that the addition of one or more than one minority population makes it harder to document jingles being complied with. So if you're looking at two populations, you have to show that those two populations vote together. You have to show block voting against the two, or look at specific elections. So you can do this, but you have to look carefully at the populations, how you're combining them, and how the electoral history works in terms of two or more populations. But it can be done. What are called influence districts, these can be drawn as well. They're not required under the VRA, and you can't sue to get an influence district under the VRA. So it's not something you have to worry about in terms of a lawsuit if you have something smaller than 50% of a CVAP population. But you can certainly draw them. Right? You have the option of drawing influence districts. You might justify them based on communities of interest or the combination of neighborhoods. But as you're doing that, you have to figure out, how does this fit in with the larger picture? Are we drawing majority minority district here, but maintaining another population next to it? You have to be careful if you're going to revisit some of the existing districts, if you're going to maybe engage what might be cracking to create multiple influence districts. I'm sure that members of the public will certainly have something to say about that if that's becoming an option or something you're considering. But you can draw influence districts, but be careful if you're you might be cracking something where you could draw one or more majority minority districts. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're going to move to the Fair Maps Act and the state criteria. You have to comply with the federal law that's built into the state listing of criteria. So population equality, constitutional requirements, VRA requirements, and then the next set of requirements under state law applicable to charter cities like Redwood City. These are ranked, so you have to comply with these criteria, and if you have to, in order to comply with a higher rank criteria, compromise a lower rank criteria, then you have to do that. So if, for example, the district is not as compact as it could be, but you're doing it to maintain contiguity, or you're doing it to maintain a particular community of interest, that's okay, because that's what the law requires. So these are ranked in order, so you have to pay attention to this set of rankings, because that's how the law is laid out. And we're going to go through each one individually. Next slide. Okay, so contiguity. Basic concept here is that you don't want a district that's sort of jumping around, so that you want to make sure the district is connected. You have a little bit of, you have some complications in Redwood City because of your natural geography and how, how parts of Redwood City are sort of, right next to the bay, or they're not, they're Redwood Shores is kind of off in its own kind of area. You have to connect. I think you have to go outside the city to connect in with the rest of the city. Obviously, you go into the hills as well. There's multiple freeways going through. So there's a lot of different things where you might have to jump around a little bit, but you have to be careful to make sure that you're not violating these contiguity principles. So there are, provisions in the law that deal with, connections. If there's water water, if you're dealing with water and separation. So I'm going to leave it to your consultant to kind of work through the specifics of that, but the basic concept is keep it all together, and don't try to connect the district just at a corner. So you can think of like a couple diamonds that connect at the points. Don't do that. Make sure there's something more than just a single point connecting two communities or two areas that you're trying to combine in the district. Next slide. So this is an example of where you have a non-contiguous district. Now, the thing is, you have to be aware of the fact that cities have very odd geography sometimes. So there are other parts of the county that may sort of finger into other parts of your city, and again, you have things like the bay goes in and out of parts of Redwood City. So just understand that it's not a perfect pure science here. So I'd certainly defer to your consultant as you're looking at how the districts will be put together. But the basic concept is, don't jump around is the core principle. Next slide. Okay, we're going to cover neighborhoods and communities. We're going to cover communities of interest more specifically, but just to lay out the definition here, you want to look at local neighborhoods, local communities of interest. Neighborhoods is not defined in the statute, but that's an area where you have some, there's an intuitive sense of what a neighborhood. It's not too spread out typically. There may be differences of opinion among the members of the public about where a neighborhood begins and ends, but it's sort of a manageable geographic area. Communities of interest, as we'll talk about in a little bit, can be somewhat broader, and it can be any number of interests that pull people together, and might affect how they're being represented on the city council. Important thing to note: there are specific prohibitions of what cannot constitute the basis for a community of interest. So You cannot consider a partisan community of interest. You can't consider a community of interest based on incumbency or on a candidate. Okay. So if you're looking, one thing to be careful with is if you're looking at current districts and maintaining the integrity of current districts, you have to be careful that's not actually incumbency protection versus just saying, well, there's something like someone may come in to you and say, well, I really like my current district, and that's fine. But you have to be careful that the underlying rationale is not to protect the current council member, that there's something that ties the community together in that district, and it's something related to neighborhood commonalities or communities of interest. Not that it's that they happen to like the current incumbent, or they dislike it, dislike the incumbent, and they want to get a new person. Next slide. Okay. So, Redwood City has a couple of sort of designations. You can decide whether you want to follow them, or maybe they need a little bit of updating given new census data. But there, you have neighborhood associations that are bound by particular boundaries. You actually have I think I use nextdoor.com as a way of the city actually uses that as a way of kind of getting a handle on neighborhoods and maybe historic neighborhoods that are in Redwood City. So, you have to work that through. And if to the extent you have maps that are, the city is maintained and that people can take a look at, that's certainly something you consider as you're deciding whether you need to maintain a neighborhood. And certainly you can rely on other information like public input, maybe census data to look at how neighborhoods are defined by demographic information. Next slide. We'll cover communities interest in more depth, but as you're looking at what is a community of interest, there's a lot of examples that often get listed, but when you're dealing with local redistricting, it's typically not as geographically diverse as say, a county or a larger unit like the state. But there are differences. So who lives near the 101, that kind of community might be quite different from who lives up, past 280, right? So there's something going on, or who lives in Redwood Shores, or who's next to Menlo Park. So there's a lot of different things that happen. You have to be very specific about differences within your particular city, but there may be some sort of natural geographies, or there are clearly a lot of transportation geographies that affect the city. And as we mentioned before, there may be racial communities of interest as well. Next slide. And we're going through all the criteria, and we'll circle back to communities of interest after I go through all the criteria. So this is actually a little different from the state level, which is using identifiable boundaries. So this is simply a way of getting, using major thoroughfares typically, but things like freeways, like a lot of cities have canals or rivers running through them. There's sort of natural boundaries that exist. So it's a way of using those kinds of boundaries to delineate between districts. And again, I don't think there's not necessarily any ranking. Freeway doesn't outrank, if a 101 doesn't outrank the 280, for example. So you have to kind of use your judgment in terms of how you use those streets, or what constitutes the major street versus a non-major street. But it's something to certainly take into account as you're creating the districts. Okay, next slide. Compactness. Okay, so the compactness in the Fair Maps Act parallels the one at the state level, which is that you have to look at compactness sort of functionally and look at how populations are concentrated. And the key language is you don't bypass nearby areas of population for more distant ones. And that's sort of mostly an eyeball test. You just have to kind of look at how the maps are being put together and the district lines are being put together. So you can get a sense by just looking at the map. Oh, we went way to the east when we could have just gone south a little bit and kept that population in, because we're going too far out to pull in one population. Now, again, you may have some good reason for doing something like that. So it may be less compact of a district because you're trying to comply with the VRA, or you're trying to keep the district contiguous. So compactness is lower ranked. So you have to consider how it weighs into your decision making. There are some mathematical tests, and there's a whole lot of software developed tests. You can check with your consultant about them if you want to, they can calculate some of that stuff just with their software. But the eyeball testing is really probably the best way to do it. You can just look at the map and say, well, we need to kind of keep it closer in terms of the population of this district. Okay, next slide. Again, prohibitions, you're not supposed to discriminate against political parties. Now, one thing to note is that even though communities of interest can't be based on incumbency or candidacy, it's not explicitly prohibited outside of communities of interest. And you're an advisory committee, so the council might very well consider things like incumbency, but let's leave it at that. I mean, again, it's not supposed to come in as community of interest, but it's not explicitly prohibited here. But the public, I'm sure, will not like it if you start drawing incumbent protected districts. Okay, but there's certainly again an explicit prohibition against partisan drawing. Next slide. Okay, so just generally, as you're doing more outreach and talking to the public, you want to let the public know that you have ranked criteria, that you're going to be using them. You need to internalize that yourself, that you have to adhere to the law, you have to keep the criteria in the right order. There's a natural tendency to look for aesthetically pleasing districts, to have nice shapes. Be aware of that and be wary of yourselves doing that or the public doing that, because it is a lower rank criterion. So compactness is something that people get a handle over because they can see the shape, but it is lower rank. So make sure that you remind yourself and remind the public that you try to have compact districts, but other criteria may be more important, and may in fact compel certain lines. I've mentioned before, VRA compliance, very important early on. Update how your current districts look in terms of VRA compliance. Look at the data, see if those districts still have, how the populations have shifted, and then try to work through some of the requirements of jingles. Be aware of the fact that you may get, we'll talk about this more as we're talking about communities of interest, but there may be conflicts that come about where you have neighborhoods where you have to decide, well, we can't maintain this neighborhood without cutting into this other neighborhood. Right? So which one do we use? When it comes to neighborhoods and communities of interest, those are all ranked equally. So to the extent you have conflicts, you have to figure out how to deal with it. You might have some prior discussion, or maybe as you're drawing the districts, you will have to make some decisions. But that inevitably comes up. You have to resolve conflicts among equally ranked criteria. And just as a general point, it's good to use neighborhoods and communities of interest as building blocks, except to the extent that people say we don't want to be next to this neighborhood, or we don't want that neighborhood because it's really different from our neighborhood. You'll always get testimony that differentiates particular areas from others. And some folks will say we have a lot in common with these folks, let's keep this all together. Others will say no, we don't have a lot in common, and we really shouldn't be in the same district. Okay, next slide. Okay, why don't we take a break before we go to the communities of interest to take any questions. There's a lot of information I've just given you in terms of the criteria. So are there any questions or clarifications?
I do have a question, Professor Ancheta. Does coming of voting age affect CVAT numbers? So if, for example, I guess you know what I mean. So
yeah, so obviously populations are revolving. So you shouldn't be trying to project ahead because you think, well, over the next 10 years this population is going to change. So the safest thing to do is, obviously you have to work with the 2020 census data. That'll get adjusted by the statewide database. You'll have numbers that will give you the base figures for total population, and there'll be some other information you could use. For VRA compliance, the best thing to do is get American Community Survey data. That's going to be the most recent data set will only go through 2019. So that's sort of lagging in terms of the data you'll have, but that is the most recent data. And there's nothing, you can't get that level of analysis out of the 2020 data. It's just not there yet. It'll be coming up, next year and the year after that. So yeah, you can't anticipate growth. You just have to kind of work with the numbers in that, in that snapshot that you get. So you've got the 2019 ACS and you've got the 2020, the data that came in through last year and through the formal census process.
Okay, we have a couple other questions in order. Member Covey, Gasparini, and then Chaudhry.
Yeah, I got questions. I spent some time looking over the slides before the meeting, and then your presentation brought out several more questions. Can we bring up page the second slide? Hello?
Yes, I got it. You'll help us jump to the second slide. Is that what you said, Member Covey?
Yeah, second slide.
Oh.
We're happy to. We are just locating it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I apologize. This isn't numbered, so I just have to, hopefully we're all agreeing on the correct slide. I think the second slide is just it has a map and an overview. Is that what you want, or is there more detailed information? That's number 2. You want the one after that?
Lou, you're muted. We can't hear you. Or you're not muted, but we can't hear you. We cannot hear you, Lou. In the meantime, while you figure out your audio, we'll jump over to committee member Gasparini.
Thanks so much, Chair Murray. So my question wraps around protecting incumbency. So as you know and mentioned, we have currently 7 districts already identified, 4 council members of which have already run in those particular districts. We currently have 1 council member representing each district. So 1 council member is already living in the 7 districts we've drawn. Mm-hmm. So let's pretend when we get our new census data that the districts all kind of grow simultaneously, or they change in a way that really doesn't need us to draw the boundaries very much differently because all the things kind of changed. If we accepted the same 7 districts and the same boundaries, is that considered then protecting incumbency?
Not necessarily. I think you'd want to document, and again, you can certainly rely on the record that was created a couple of years ago as to why those districts are drawn the way they are. Obviously, it doesn't hurt incumbents, right? Because there they are in the same district, right? So, but it goes to justification. Right. So if you say, well, we've gone through a process and we feel based on public input, and obviously, again, you had a pretty extensive input process a couple of years ago too. So that's not irrelevant to what you could consider. But I think you certainly you don't want to just rely solely on that. You want to have a process this year that parallels that. But it's not irrelevant. So, but you want to say, well, the reason these districts are good is because a couple of years ago we got a lot of input and it hasn't changed that much, and we're hearing similar stuff this time around, and we feel that the best map we think is to kind of keep it mostly the same. Does that protect incumbents? Sure, but there's an underlying rationale that covers other bases. So I think you just want to make sure you're kind of dotting your I's and crossing your T's. But right, again, you're not unique in that because a number of cities just converted to district and went through a similar process. So it's a good question. That's coming up in a lot of places.
Hi. Committee member Covey, we can test your audio.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Everything just went ape. So, well, we threw out the picture of District 3, and from your description, it sounds like that's a really bad district because it's divided by 101, it's divided by Woodside Road.
So let's go back to the prior slide then, because
So you can see it's divided by 101, it's divided by Woodside Road, and it's even divided by Middlefield and El Camino.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm not implying anything. I'm just being agnostic. And if I say something about a freeway or anything that's related to Redwood City, it's not meant to say anything.
Well, I mean, that's one point.
Yeah.
The second point is that the district was formed specifically because 65% of the population is Hispanic.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so it was
Yeah.
specifically formed for Hispanics. I'm sorry, maybe that's not the right word now, is it? Latinx?
Yeah, you can Latinx.
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm doing it right. But the problem is that the voter turnout in District 3 has historically been abysmal, even before it wasn't a district. So you can't really say that you've packed a lot of Latinx into this because they aren't voting. So do we need to take that into account when we are maybe reforming the districts? I mean, shouldn't we expand
it's
it?
something you should consider. And again, I don't want to leave the impression that I'm suggesting anything about Redwood City. I'm just throwing out things that I know about Redwood City, having been through Redwood City and driven through and eaten at restaurants in Redwood City. So if I say anything about the city, don't take that as anything related to how you might draw a district. But getting to your point about that particular district and its current population, as I mentioned before, very often with Asian and Latino populations, that's a common approach, which is to raise the percentage above 50%. So you might be looking at 55, 60%, but it's a very nuanced inquiry because you have to look at the electoral, and I don't know if this was done a few years ago, but you have to kind of look at the electoral history because if turnout is significantly lower, you might have to adjust those numbers up. And again, I don't know how that was, how that was discussed a few years ago, but it's something I would take a look at. Now, again, you do have to, there's a sort of a ceiling you have to be concerned about too, because if you start going, oh, let's push it up to 70, 75%, then there's this packing problem that comes into play. But if you leave it down at around 50, 51%, you might say, well, that's not an effective district because given historical turnout and just the nature of elections and candidacies from looking at recent elections, that's maybe too low. We have to bump it up a bit to call it a majority Latino district. And again, there's not a magic number there, but it's certainly above 50%. And I only threw out 75% as an example, but you do want to be careful about over concentrating the population.
So yeah, that was what I was thinking, that we have a lot of work to do on District 3.
Yeah, and again, the thing, again, you know this better than I do. You have to kind of look at what happened a couple of years ago, and you didn't go through a full-blown lawsuit, right? So when you go through a full-blown lawsuit, the plaintiffs introduce evidence of polarized voting, and I don't think you have that in the record from a couple of years ago. So again, if you work on the assumption that voting is polarized, it'd be good to document where you got that, right? Now, you can rely on academic studies, you can rely on stuff the state may be doing over the next couple of months. But I don't think you have it from 2 years ago, when you actually, or 3 years ago when litigation was first contemplated. So I think you have to do a little bit of extra work to again, kind of dot your I's and cross your T's.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Committee member Chaudhry.
Thank you. I have a quick question about data. Is there any, compared to like the last, redistricting process, nowadays we have like a lot more data sources available. My question is that, is there any like requirements regarding like which data sources we can use, and if we are using sources other than census, American Community Survey, is there any specifications on how to document those sources and present them?
Yeah. So just for population equality purposes and the base data that you're using to look at district population size, you need to use 2020 total population data. Okay, it'll be adjusted to comply with state law, and that's the package that your consultant will be working with. That's sort of the official data for population equality purposes. For VRA compliance, again, the commonly used data set is the American Community Survey, and the most recent one is one that ended in 2019. You don't have to use that if you can rely on some other source that has comparable information. So there may be, Department of Finance data from the state, or maybe something that San Mateo County has. Redwood City itself may be looking at some data. When you're looking at things like communities of interest, if you have some, when it comes to communities of interest in neighborhoods, it's much more open. Now you have to deal with reliability of sources. Is it up to date? Is it as precise as you want it to be? But there's no restriction on looking when you're talking about not outside of population equality, and probably outside of VRA compliance, because it's very unusual to use non-ACS data. You can look at any kind of data set you want, really, but you have to kind of assess whether it's good data for purposes of what you're using it for. So again, you might have some stuff that's more up to date, or it might be very detailed because maybe the census did some, the city of Redwood City did some surveys, or San Mateo County did some data gathering that might be helpful. There's nothing prohibiting you from doing that, but you have to kind of assess whether it's good for what you want to use it for.
And so my other kind of question was like regarding identifying population clusters, like usually when you're working with census data or American Community Survey at block level or tract level, you do get information on population, number of people in that tract or block, but you don't necessarily get an idea or where in that tract or block group are they located,
Yeah.
So how do you deal with those kind of issues?
Yeah. Well, and again, I'll defer to your consultant here, but obviously the census data that you'll get in at some point in the next month or two will be the most up to date, at least from the federal government, and it will be more detailed in terms of geography because it'll be block level. So block level is the smallest unit you can work with. Block group is higher, and the ACS has block group. The problem is that redistricting data for 2020 is not that extensive, right? It's precise in terms of population of blocks, and it's got some demographic characteristics, but it's not as detailed as will come out later, right? So this is well beyond your deadlines, right? So as you go into next year and the following year, there'll be a lot more specific data coming out of 2020, but you really only have the basic population and a couple of demographic characteristics. So if you're, say for example, you're trying to determine whether a community of interest is sort of what people are saying, here's a community of interest, and we want to kind of make sure that that's right, or we have to come up with, the boundaries aren't as precise as we would like. We're jumping a little bit ahead to the discussion of communities of interest, but you want to look at some data to help you do a better job, right? So that's where you have to kind of think, well, what do we have to work with here? Should we look at the ACS data, or is there some state, maybe the state has some data that we could use here that might be helpful, or someone's done some surveys locally. You're near some universities that might, maybe somebody's done some research, that kind of thing. But you have to assess whether that is it really that helpful, or how reliable it would be in terms of what you want to do compared to what you get from the federal government.
Thank you. Next, we have Ray Brown, who has a question.
Yes, Professor, it's great demonstration. Thank you very much for all the great information. I've got a lot of notes here, so thank you. I've got three things maybe I can throw at you. Some of this is probably obvious. Number one is you put a lot of emphasis on this polarized data. That's important to you. That sounds like it's pretty good. That's available somewhere, I'm sure. We can get our hands on it.
Well, it's data that somebody has to crunch, okay? Because
no, I understand that, but it's available. It's what I'm
Yeah.
asking.
So
And-
typically what ends up happening is you get somebody, if you really want to do a thorough analysis. Now the thing is, you're not suing under Section 2. You're anticipating or trying to defend yourself against potential litigation. So what typically happens is you look at local electoral data, take a couple city council elections, maybe some assembly races, something, or maybe county board of supervisors. But typically you look at, for your city, the local stuff. And they'll get some data from the statewide database in terms of race relevant data. And there's different kinds of analyses you use, but it's a combination of stuff you can get from from San Mateo County, from the the elections registrar basically, and then
Right.
they have to get some race data that comes from the statewide database. But it's not something it's something you have to get somebody to do it. You really
No,
want to
I got that. Yeah, but based on your comments, you think it's important. The second one was who was the consultant and when will we be privy to have access to this individual? I guess that's something that maybe not the best place to ask that question, but would love to find.
I'd work with your consultant because there's a lot. Typically, the folks who do this are either political scientists, maybe folks who are statisticians. Sometimes you get historians who do specialize in kind of mathematical stuff,
Right.
and they can whip it out pretty fast. It's not cheap, so you have to kind of weigh how much you want to do it and weigh it against whatever budget you have to do this kind of analysis.
Yeah, that's the internal question. I'm sure we have access to that. I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that. And the third and last is you talked about this COI, this community of interest. It sounds rather esoteric, this whole thing. This is not a science, it's an art. And maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
And that's the next topic. We'll go through that in more detail. But the irony is it's very highly ranked under the state criteria, but it's the least defined. So it's really important, but it's really open-ended. And that's somewhat by design, because it's a way to get public participation about what unites people in terms of their interest and how that ties in with representation at whatever level of government. But and you get more, depending on where you go, you get a lot of detailed examples, but it's designed to be open-ended. So you have to, we'll cover this in a few moments. You have to decide how to best process the data and how to get it from folks in your communities and make it usable, because one of the dangers, and this is something we encountered at the state level, you get a lot of data, and it may or may not be helpful in terms of actually drawing districts. So it's a challenge, but it's also a big part of the process, because you want the public to give you important information that means something to them. So why don't we jump back? Unless there's another question, we can jump forward to that part of the slides. Okay, thank you. Was there another question on, at least on the past criteria we covered? Okay.
No, we can move forward. Thank you.
Okay, so again, communities of interest, high ranked criterion, but fuzzy and challenging to deal with. And probably even more challenging at the state level, because there's so many different ways you can define communities of interest, but more manageable at the local level, because it's tightly related to neighborhood. The neighborhood, at least intuitively, is a little bit more manageable. So again, it's tied to the process. You want to think about it how communities of interest are related to the level of government you're dealing with, which is city council and city government. You don't want people telling you about stuff that really is outside of the city council's bailiwick. If they start talking about federal policy and has nothing to do with what the city council does, that may not be a good community of interest. The process is something you can get started on right now as you're waiting for the census data to come in. They can serve as building blocks. And as I mentioned before, it may be ways of separating different neighborhoods and communities of interest to draw lines between them. And as I mentioned, when it comes to maybe racial or ethnic communities of interest, that may relate closely to how the VRA is being complied. Next slide. So again, the definition is fairly broad. It has to be local, but shares common social or economic interests. Cannot be based on party, incumbency, or political candidacies. So what are those social and economic interests? Next slide. Okay, so again, local. You mentioned these already. Oh, a couple points here. Under state law, there's no requirement that they be contiguous. So you can have a community of interest that might be close together, but it comes in different pockets or sections. So it could be, say for example, an economic a community that's closely bound by economic commonalities or income or something related to, say, property ownership, that kind of thing. But there's something that maybe separates them because of it could be something like a freeway or a highway, or it could be a natural boundary, something like that. So it doesn't have to be contiguous. So that gives you some flexibility. One other point here is that there may be something as you're getting close to the boundaries of Redwood City where it could be an adjacent city, or it's something that it's outside your jurisdiction, but the community of interest is broader. But you can certainly recognize it. It's just you can't do anything about it beyond the Redwood City boundaries. So be aware that you might be aware of the fact that you might get local communities of interest that are transcend city boundaries, but you can still keep it intact. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm listing here just an example of how one jurisdiction, and this is a different state, so this is Colorado, but this is a recent amendment to the Constitution, but they actually articulate several examples of communities of interest. Now, obviously, Colorado is a state and it's different. The geography is quite different from, say, California, or certainly from Northern California, but an example of listing different types of communities of interest: so urban, rural, agricultural, industrial, trade. Some examples tied to policy concerns: education, employment, environment, etc. And they have a specific listing of racial and ethnic and language minority, again, VRA term. Now, again, this is not how California does it. This is not how the Fair Maps Act does it. I mean, California's state law has a few examples, but you may want to think about, if you want to, in your outreach materials, list possible examples. I wouldn't limit it, certainly, to enumerated ones, but you might want to think about giving examples that tie into how the city council does its work, or what may be geographies within Redwood City that might be customized for your own jurisdiction. But if you don't get specific, it's fine. You're going to get more general and maybe less useful information if you don't give examples. But you have to make a policy decision about how you want to limit or provide examples to the public. Next slide. Another element of communities of interest in the Fair Maps Act, it has to be related to, or it's tied to representation. So it has to be related to what's happening at the level of government. So in this case, Redwood City is a city, and you're dealing with city council responsibilities. You have to think about because people don't always think about specifically what can my city council member do for me, and how does my neighborhood get affected in these ways. But you want to have some connection. And it's not too hard typically, because there may be some commonalities related to things like law enforcement, or regulation, or the infrastructure, or zoning. There's a lot of things that people have in common that ties in with city council membership. The important thing here is that a lot of times you may hear information from the public that has to do more with federal government, maybe state level government. So you have to decide, well, that doesn't quite fit within what we're trying to do in terms of city council boundaries. So how much should we weigh something that has to do, say, with a federal income tax policy, or something related to immigration policy, just at the federal level. It's not really something the city council engages in, so you might have to discount some of that testimony. Next slide. Just an example. Actually, and this is not meant to me. When I give examples, I'm not trying to say, well, that airport must be something in Redwood City, or he's talking about SFO or something. This is just a general example I give. But but it's an example of something that's tied in to transportation. So, folks who live near an airport might have a lot in common in terms of issues related to noise abatement, zoning, traffic. A lot of times when you're dealing with airport proximity, it may be, housing values are lower, folks may be renters, or maybe lower income. It may be something that the city council itself has particular policy interests, maybe oversight. So this is just an example of a community of interest that's tied in with transportation, but there are obviously a lot of different examples of one could think of too. Okay, next slide. Racial and ethnic communities of interest. Again, there's a close relation, obviously, with VRA compliance. If you're looking at, for example, you have, we were talking about one example of a district that's majority Latino. The demographics of Redwood City are diverse. Latinos aren't the only minority population in the city, so you have to kind of think about how communities of interest with smaller populations, or even if you're dealing with Latinos, it might be, a smaller population in other districts within the city that you want to maintain together, because there's a community there that deserves some protection in terms of maintaining its integrity. So the main thing here is, again, be careful about using just race as a community of interest. It's kind of shorthand a lot of times, but as you're documenting your work, make sure that you've got some other factors that are weighing into your consideration. That's not just an ethnic population, it's something related to, commonalities related to income status or economics or some neighborhood characteristics. Okay. And last point on the slide here, just be careful about jumping around too much, because that can raise concerns about being so non-compact that you're just drawing it to keep a minority population together, that there's not something else that could pull it into one place. Next slide. Okay, so implementation challenges. So this is just trying to figure out how you're doing input, or at least how you're doing outreach, and then getting input, and then how you're dealing with all the data. Hopefully you'll get a lot of data, but that can be an issue too, but not getting enough information that's useful. So again, I mentioned before, you might want to enumerate examples of communities of interest. I would not recommend saying these are the only kinds of communities of interest. That's probably too limiting. You want to make sure you get useful information, but let the public give you information. If it's helpful, use it. If it's not so helpful, you can just give it less weight or don't consider it at all as you're compiling the data. Be careful about communities of interest that are too big. You often get testimony that about communities that are very large. Folks who are on the shore, or folks who are up against the hills. So that may be an area or a community that can't fit in a single district. Right? It might be a community that covers 6 districts. It's a very big one. So be mindful of the size of the community of interest as you're getting information. Overlapping communities of interest is always interesting. Sometimes neighborhoods. One neighborhood transitions into another neighborhood. How are you drawing the boundaries? Are there disagreements about the neighborhoods or the communities of interest? You may be faced, unfortunately, with some conflicts between neighborhoods or different communities of interest. They're equally ranked, so you have to kind of decide how you're going to resolve some of those conflicts. There's nothing in the law about how to do that. You have to kind of use your judgment or work through a process for doing that. We've talked mostly about public input and public comments coming in various forms. You can look, as one commissioner mentioned, or committee member mentioned, there's other kinds of data you can use. You can rely on census data. You can look at state or local data that might be helpful in delineating communities of interest or neighborhoods. If you want to invest a little bit more in terms of some statistical analyses, there are techniques that are in the redistricting community. There are techniques that have been put forward in terms of doing statistical analyses that look at different demographic characteristics and things that are ways of clustering the data, or looking at compiling several data points into some manageable set of factors so you can get a sense of what a community looks like. You can look at electoral data. If you look at ballot initiative voting, for example, that's a way of not getting into party or candidacies specifically. That may be insightful. Again, a little extra work, maybe require more resources if you want to kind of do that, but that can be helpful. You want to look into that. Bottom line is you must have public comment, and I would strongly recommend you take a look at just the basic social and economic data that you get from the census to get a handle on the communities and where you can draw lines more easily. Next slide. So just a couple highlights here. Ideally you'll get testimony from different parts of the city. Obviously all of you are residents, and it's it's not a gigantic geographic area, so you have a good sense of the city, but there's certainly parts of the city you may not have visited yourself or you don't know much about. And as you get public testimony, you're not hearing from people, and you have to figure out, well, how are we going to define this particular area? What's our basis for saying this is a community or this is a neighborhood that belongs in a district compared to in another district? So there may be gaps. You may get information from the public that's not as precise as you'd like. They don't give you clear boundaries, or they're not quite what you thought they were, and maybe you have to kind of double check on what that actual boundary could be. People, much of the information you're getting is going to be fairly subjective. So what do people perceive as their own neighborhoods? What do people perceive as a community? That may not be consistent across different sources. So be aware of that. That can be a problem. We've mentioned overlapping. Folks. All of a sudden there's a kind of we historically there's been here's neighborhood A and there's neighborhood B, but now A and B are kind of intersecting, and where do we put them, or how do we divide it, or they don't want to have something in common, and so there's some challenges there when you're dealing with adjacent communities. And then the last thing to mention here is what happens if you get folks who are mobilized and they start giving you a whole bunch of the same information. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it's part of the process that folks get together, they organize, they give you. They're trying to give you information to influence your decision making, but it's also possible to get form letters and mass emails, and you have to decide how you're going to weight some of that, and you have to be careful that some of that might in fact be not so much community based, but maybe partisan based or incumbent based. So not to say that that's going to happen, but there are always folks who have political interest in particular district line. So you have to kind of figure out, well, if we're getting a lot of information about this district, who's organizing this, and what are they trying to do? So that there may be ulterior motives, something that have something more to do with prohibited criteria compared to just community interests. Okay, next slide. So just some general points here. I mean, this is something you have more discussion about in terms of how you're doing your input. There are some basic requirements under the Fair Maps Act in terms of sort of minimum number of hearings and making sure that the public has access to it. But you're certainly, you can exceed the minimum number. You can have as many as you want within a manageable timeline. It's a good idea. Obviously, we're dealing with some challenges with resurgence of COVID and how to do things virtually versus in person. You maybe, unfortunately, have to do most, if not all, your work virtually, but to the extent you're able to maybe do some public hearings, if that happens later in the year, think about where they're located and trying to spread it around the city and making sure people are able to participate at different hours, evenings and weekends, and some folks during the day. How do you want to use, or how do you want to give the public an opportunity to provide input? Do you want to put paper forms together, online tools like District R, which is something the consultant will be working with? District R is a very sophisticated, it's a very powerful web-based tool. A lot of folks will be comfortable with that. Other folks will not. They may simply want to give you an oral and narrative description of their community or neighborhood, or they may want to give you, just photocopy a map and draw some lines where they think the community will be. That's just as effective as something drawn online. You just have to be able to use that data and translate it into something that can be compiled and put together. But the point here is just be welcome all kinds of different input, and be prepared to just kind of try to get it into a manageable shape so that your consultant can work with you on drawing district lines. Next slide. So a couple of points here. Very important, catalog all this information you're getting. Keep a good database. Make it something that the public can access. Make sure that, or think through how you are going to deal with some of these conflicts. How are you going to weight testimony? Again, there is this issue about being, mobilized testimony and getting, you get, 100 different emails that say kind of the same thing, but is that necessarily weighted 500 times more than a single individual testimony? That seems to be quite, quite thoughtful and useful. Think about how that counts. But again, mobilized testimony is important too, because it reflects multiple sources, multiple individuals who are maybe saying the same thing, not simply because they're mobilized, but because they have a lot in common. You'll probably, of course, get groups who are working on it could be neighborhood associations, could be civil rights groups who are working on particular interests that will come in. How much do you weigh those relative to individuals? That's something to think about. It is possible that if you get a lot of data, a lot of input from the public, there may be ways of sort of cherry picking information. I would be careful about just sort of drawing district lines and then just kind of going back afterwards and looking at community of interest information versus actually looking at that information first, the community and the neighborhood information first, and then trying to build districts based on those. It's very easy to find something in the data that will support a district, but it's better, I think, to have a process that builds on smaller units. One thing you might consider, if you have the time and the resources, is maybe developing some prior to actual district drawing, maybe developing some sorts of visualizations that give you a sense of where you think you are, or where you've identified particular neighborhoods or communities. Again, you have some city-based neighborhoods and neighborhood councils or associations that might be useful. Other kinds of data. You might want to put some of that out there even before you draw districts, because the public can comment on some of that if you have the time within your timeline and the resources. And again, as a general matter, you only have to draw one draft. It's all that's required under the state law. But if you think you want to have have specific drafts related to particular districts, or you want to have more than one draft, and you think you can manage that within your timeline, that's a good way of getting a lot of input early on that's related to your districts. And very useful information can come out of hearing from the public on draft maps. Some of our best comments came not before we do drafts, but after we do drafts, because people once they actually see district lines, they get really much more activated and want to give comments on that. So consider whether you want to have more than one draft as you process it.
Angelo, before you continue, I want to take some time for some questions. We're about the 30-minute countdown. So
okay.
If the group has
we're at the end. I think we're at the end, actually. You can go to the next slide. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Perfect timing. So use the hand raise function if you have any questions. I also have a question, but I will cede to any of the other members if they have one. All right, seeing none. I have a question. What are some of the most inclusive methods of taking public input? I saw a long list of ways to do it. What are some of the ways that if you were to pick, one or two that we must do, what are those recommendations to be really inclusive with the public?
Yeah. Well, again, and this is a challenge because you're in the COVID era, and I think we were all thinking things were going to get better, and now they seem to be, things are sort of ratcheting up again, which is unfortunate. So you have to kind of be strategic about how you're doing, how you're planning around actual live meetings in person, and that may be something ultimately you decide you're not going to do just for safety reasons. So that unfortunately is a really good way to bring people out, because you can actually go to neighborhoods and people don't have to go so far. They don't have to rely on their computers. Now, if you can't do that and you have to rely on computers, you have to kind of maybe think about low-tech solutions, which might allow folks, not have to rely on a mapping program like District R. You might want to the extent possible, if you can deal with local media that people are expected to use. It's more expensive, obviously, to do things like television buys or cable TV, but there may be some avenues on social media that could be useful to get a hold of people. The hard thing is, of course, there's nothing universal, right? So, and particularly when you're dealing with, minority populations, particularly, limited English speaking or English as second language populations. Are you doing enough outreach to all these different communities where English isn't their first language? So that's an important part of it. There's no one size fits all, but I think it's particularly challenging because at this point you might have to be heavily reliant on virtual input. The other thing is there's an advantage to that too, because if more people are comfortable in it now, using Zoom and other kinds of or phone-in systems, so it gives you a little bit more control and it gives you a little bit more reach, because the disadvantage of physical is that people actually have to get out of their homes and go someplace. So, the other thing I would suggest, and you can draw on other cities if you, or your consultant can certainly, redistricting partners can work with you on this in terms of, forms and, sample types of input that can be useful for the compilation of data. So there's a lot of written stuff that can be very useful. And and encourage people to send emails, because a lot of times you can't get everything you want in 2 or 3 minutes of testimony, and some people are nervous and they could feel, oh, well, as long as I can send an email or I can attach a map, like they kind of understand to do that, and I'll send it in.
Yeah, I imagine that providing an opinion on a district in 3 minutes or less is pretty challenging.
Yeah.
I want to give some time for Vice Chair Lacefield and then Committee Member Selk.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering if there's any like guidance or prohibition against doing something like reaching out to community partners to make sure that people have digital access. For example, if you have partnerships with, community churches or something like that, where you could make sure that they have the equipment available for people to be able to participate in some of these virtual environments. I know several groups have made computers available, but instead of for individuals, you can make them available at community centers or something like that, particularly in the specific districts. Is there any reason you shouldn't do that? And has anybody tried something like that in the hopes of sort of expanding the digital involvement?
I don't think there's a prohibition. I'll give in a moment. I'll give a caution, but there's certainly parallels at the state level where there were redistricting centers that people could go to. Now, again, this is a budget and a resource question, so you have to figure out how much can we actually spend on this and in augmenting the existing infrastructure to get people engaged with being able to use a computer and getting some help, or having someone just sort of walk them through the process. So you want to deal with folks who have less access and improve that access. The thing you have to be careful about too, and you're not set up as an independent commission, but it's always important to kind of give the public the sense that you're not favoring anybody, because there's such local politics involved here. We're not favoring the city council, even though ultimately they get final say. So we can't escape that part of the process. But as a committee, you want to say, well, we're trying to be even-handed here. We're trying to hear everybody as best we can. But we understand there's certain populations here that because we have to go more digital, it's just kind of the way it is right now, because we have to rely on non-in-person input. We need to work with that. So I think you're safe with trying to help improve the infrastructure there, but just make sure everybody has a way of accessing and giving you input. As long as people feel it's a fair process and it's an open process, and you're not sort of giving computers to that community, that group over there, but it's a way of kind of making sure everybody is getting access. I think you should be fine.
Committee Member Selk.
Yeah, thank you. I have about 50 to 100 people, if not more, walk by my front door every day. I mean, or more. It could be, I live in a very busy pedestrian neighborhood. Is there anything against putting out a stack of paper maps or putting everyone's email on a piece of paper and having people pick it up in English and in Spanish, sitting on the doorstep, not doorstep, like out on the edge? I have no idea what kinds of laws. I'm really thinking about how in this environment, people aren't going to community centers. They're just taking walks in neighborhoods. And so I was wondering if there's a way of doing that that is actually fair and okay to do.
Yeah. Well, I'll defer to your city attorney on that.
I was just going to suggest the same. I think City Attorney Ramirez can answer that.
But the other, just as a sort of policy concern, is again, you want to have fairness. So if that's something you're going to do in your neighborhood, you want to give people a sense of, well, we're doing it in a lot of, it's not everywhere in the city, obviously, but there's an even-handedness to it, that folks, everybody in the city can at least go someplace and get that kind of help. It's not sort of, this committee member's house, right? Or if you want to go, you have to go across town over there to get it because she's the only one who offers it. So that's the concern. That would be the concern.
Oh, definitely. My other question is, I've now read several articles about the census data not being ready and that the California group is asking for an extension on all sorts of things. Is that actually going to affect us as well in terms of our timeline? Could we be pushed out a month or 2 months?
Well, again, I'll defer to your city attorney because they're going to be staying on top of what the latest developments will be. So just in terms of, because everybody's waiting for the census data. So the triggering date, at least to get something from the federal government, is expected to be August 16th. And after August 16th, they're getting the statewide database, which is the source of your data as well as everybody else's in California. They're going to process that data because it's actually it's coming in a raw form. The official data in a usable format doesn't show up until September 30th. But we're getting our data set early, and hopefully there's no glitches in terms of either getting the data and no glitches with the statewide database processing it to make it look like the official data. So the expectation is that probably, near the end of, or maybe, I don't know, maybe August 23rd to August 31st, somewhere in that time frame, there will be a data set that would be like the federal government's official one. But having said that, there's still some additional processing that has to go on in terms of getting it cleaned up and getting the prisoner reallocation accomplished. So you're not going to get that data probably until somewhere later in September, maybe as early as maybe the second week, but probably third, maybe even later in September. But some point in September, you'll get that database, right? In terms of your timelines, don't rely on the state level because it's on its own track, okay? So there are efforts to try to maybe get some kind of fix at the state level legislatively to change some of the deadlines. This is where your city attorney needs to kind of stay on top of that, and don't count on that. So you may have to work with those December deadlines, and yeah, just kind of work with those for now. Would be the safest thing. But yeah, I think I'm sure the staff is very mindful of this moving target at this point. But this is a time when, again, this is when you can do VRA preparation. This is where you can start getting your outreach and input process, and you don't need census data to hear people's opinions of their neighborhoods.
I'm going to pass the floor to City Attorney Ramirez.
Thank you. And just, following up on the two questions that you're speaking of. One, regarding the community outreach, I love the creativity. Right now, we're having to really figure this out in a whole new world. And so that is going to be one of the things that this committee will be tasked with. And please continue thinking that. And that is one of the things that redistricting partners and city staff will be working with this committee on, creating your community outreach and finding a way for it to be even-handed to make sure that you hear from all of the communities within Redwood City. The second question was, regarding the deadlines and shifts. And we do have Redistricting Partners has been staying on top of it. The last I've heard, there is no change to the local process. I have been asking for the last year whether we're going to get any reprieve. I have been told we should just stay with our deadlines because it doesn't seem like anything is coming. But I do see someone's hands raised from Redistricting Partners, so we may be getting an update.
Chris, are you from Redistricting Partners? Cannot hear you. And you're not muted, so you may be having some audio issues.
This is Kimmy from Redistricting Partners. I don't believe that, I think that's a different Chris than the one on our team that's generally here. Okay. And so as far as-
but Chris, if you're a member of the public, we've already passed a section for public comment and referred to the city clerk on how we manage that. Sorry, Kimmy, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but Chris did have his hand up, so.
Sure. So just in terms of the deadline, the State Redistricting Commission has asked for an extension that has not trickled down, though, to anybody else at this point. So for right now, your city staff is absolutely correct. We're moving forward with the dates as they sit right now.
Thanks, Kimmy. Are there any further questions from the committee members? Okay. Is there anything else did you want to add, Angelo?
No, not at this point. It's exciting times. You're going, challenging, of course, obviously, but it's a lot of fun. I mean, to be honest, it's a lot of fun. I mean, even if it's only on by phone or virtually, it's fun hearing from the public, and I like drawing maps. It's kind of fun. Obviously, you joined this commission for a reason, so I wish you luck with it. It's a challenging time, but it's an important thing you're doing too. It's a really important part of the process.
Thank you very much. And it seems like we're coming to an end. We have 20 minutes left. So I just want to remind the committee and the public that our next meeting is August 11th of this year at 6 p.m. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.